Every secret tells a story.
The village of Little Wickham had always prided itself on tradition, and nowhere was this more evident than during the annual Harvest Lantern Festival. As the September evening settled like a gentle shawl over the thatched cottages and winding lanes, the village green transformed into a constellation of warm, flickering lights. Paper lanterns in jewel tones hung from the ancient oak trees, while villagers of all ages carried their own handcrafted illuminations, creating a moving tapestry of amber and gold against the gathering dusk. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her position on the weathered wooden bench near the war memorial, her knitting needles working steadily on what would become a winter scarf for her nephew Raymond. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire festival while appearing to be nothing more than a harmless elderly lady enjoying the evening's festivities. Her keen blue eyes, however, missed very little of the subtle dramas unfolding around her. The evening's central figure was Mr. Reginald Thornbury, chairman of the parish council and owner of Thornbury & Sons, the village's most prosperous business. At 62, he possessed the bearing of a man accustomed to having his opinions matter and his wishes carried out without question. Tonight, he had the honor of lighting the great lantern, a magnificent Victorian piece that had belonged to his family for 3 generations, in the ceremony that would officially close the festival. Mr. Thornbury stood near the bandstand, consulting his pocket watch with the precision of a man for whom punctuality was both virtue and weapon. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the subtle tensions rippling through the crowd like stones cast into still water. Mrs. Dorothy Ashford, the postmistress, kept glancing nervously toward Mr. Thornbury while clutching a sealed envelope against her chest. Her usually ruddy complexion had taken on a pale, almost greenish cast that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Near the refreshment tent, young David Thornbury, Reginald's nephew and heir apparent to the family business, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Miss Patricia Wells, the village schoolteacher. Their body language suggested a relationship that had progressed far beyond professional courtesy, though David's frequent glances toward his uncle indicated this development might not meet with family approval. Dr. Harrison Pembridge, the village physician, moved through the crowd with his characteristic quiet efficiency, pausing to check on elderly Mrs. Bentley's arthritis and to examine young Tommy Fletcher's scraped knee with equal attention. Yet Miss Marple noticed that his usual warm demeanor seemed strained tonight, and his medical bag, which he rarely carried to social functions, remained firmly attached to his side. When he thought no one was watching, his gaze would settle on Mr. Thornbury with an expression that was difficult to read but certainly not friendly. The Reverend Michael Hartwell, still relatively new to his position after replacing the beloved Reverend Clark the previous year, hovered near the edges of groups, clearly wanting to participate but uncertain of his place in the village's complex social hierarchy. His nervousness was particularly evident whenever Mr. Thornbury's voice carried across the green, and Miss Marple had observed him checking and rechecking the small piece of paper he kept folded in his jacket pocket. As the church clock struck 8, Mr. Thornbury took his position beside the great lantern. The magnificent piece stood nearly 5 feet tall, its brass fittings polished to mirror brightness, and its glass panels decorated with intricate etchings of harvest scenes. The crowd gathered in a respectful semicircle, children pushed to the front where they could see, adults arranging themselves according to the invisible but well-understood social order that governed all village gatherings. "Friends and neighbors," Mr. Thornbury began, his voice carrying the authority of generations of Thornburys who had led this same ceremony. "We gather tonight as our ancestors have gathered for over a century to mark the end of harvest and to light our way into the darker months ahead." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her attention was fully focused on the scene before her. She noticed several things that might have seemed insignificant to a casual observer. The way Mrs. Ashford's hands trembled as she clutched her envelope, how David Thornberry's jaw tightened at his uncle's words about ancestors and tradition, and the manner in which Dr. Pembridge had positioned himself with a clear view of both the lantern and the crowd. Mr. Thornberry struck a long match with practiced ceremony, the small flame dancing in the gentle evening breeze. "May this light guide us through whatever darkness lies ahead," he declared, reaching toward the lantern's base where the wick awaited ignition. The match touched the wick, and for one perfect moment the great lantern blazed to life. Its colored glass panels cast dancing patterns across the upturned faces of the villagers. Ruby red, sapphire blue, and emerald green painting the crowd in jeweled light. A collective sigh of appreciation rose from the gathering, followed by warm applause. Then, as suddenly as it had flared to life, the lantern went out. The extinction was not gradual, like a candle guttering in the wind, but complete and instantaneous, as if someone had thrown a switch. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd, punctuated by nervous laughter and children's questions about what had gone wrong. "Not to worry," Mr. Thornberry announced, though Miss Marple detected a note of irritation beneath his composed exterior. "These old mechanisms can be temperamental. I'll just need a moment to adjust the wick." He lifted the lantern's brass top, peering inside with the confidence of a man who had performed this ritual many times before. Miss Marple, from her position 20 feet away, noticed something that made her pause in her knitting. A faint, sweet smell that didn't belong among the usual festival aromas of wood smoke, roasted chestnuts, and autumn leaves. It was chemical, almost medicinal, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the lantern. Mr. Thornberry worked for several minutes, his movements becoming increasingly frustrated as the wick refused to cooperate. "Perhaps if we move to better light?" suggested Dr. Pembridge, stepping forward. "I have a torch in my bag." "Quite unnecessary," Mr. Thornberry replied curtly. "I've been lighting this lantern since before you arrived in this village, Doctor. I hardly need assistance with my own family's—" His words cut off abruptly. For a moment he swayed slightly, one hand gripping the lantern's base for support. Miss Marple saw his face clearly in the light from the surrounding paper lanterns. Confusion, then alarm, then something that might have been recognition. "I say," he began, his voice oddly thick, "I feel rather—" Mr. Reginald Thornberry, pillar of Little Wickham society and keeper of its traditions, collapsed beside his family's great lantern like a marionette whose strings had been suddenly cut. The brass top of the lantern, still clutched in his hand, struck the ground with a clear, bell-like note that seemed to hang in the air long after its maker had fallen silent. In the stunned quiet that followed, as Dr. Pembridge rushed forward and the crowd pressed closer in that terrible human instinct to witness disaster, Miss Marple remained seated on her bench. Her knitting lay still in her lap now, and her eyes moved methodically from face to face in the lantern-lit crowd. She had seen death before, too many times in too many places, and she knew with a certainty that comes from long experience that what had just occurred was no accident. The great lantern lay on its side, its light extinguished forever, while around it the smaller paper lanterns continued their gentle dance in the evening breeze. In the growing darkness of Little Wickham, Miss Marple understood that someone had just committed the perfect crime, or so they believed. But in her long experience, she had learned that there was no such thing as a perfect crime, only crimes whose imperfections had not yet been properly observed. The festival was over, but for Miss Jane Marple, the real investigation was just beginning. The moments following Mr. Thornberry's collapse unfolded with that peculiar mixture of chaos and ritual that accompanies unexpected death in small communities. Dr. Pembridge was beside the fallen man, before the echo of the lantern's brass top striking the ground had faded, his medical bag already open and his movements carrying the swift efficiency of long practice. The crowd instinctively formed a respectful circle, close enough to witness but far enough to allow the doctor room to work, their faces illuminated by paper lanterns that now seemed almost mocking in their cheerful persistence. Miss Marple remained on her bench, her knitting forgotten in her lap, but her mind working with methodical precision. She watched as Dr. Pembridge checked for a pulse at the throat, then the wrist, lifted Mr. Thornberry's eyelids to examine his pupils, and placed his ear close to the man's chest. The doctor's movements were thorough but increasingly mechanical, and Miss Marple recognized the subtle shift from treatment to confirmation that she had witnessed too many times before. "I'm very sorry," Dr. Pembridge said quietly, rising to his feet and brushing grass from his knees, his voice carrying across the hushed green. "Mr. Thornberry has passed away. There's nothing more to be done." The collective gasp that followed was quickly replaced by that peculiar silence that settles over people when death arrives uninvited at their celebrations. Mrs. Bentley began to weep softly, more from shock than grief, while several of the younger children pressed closer to their parents, sensing the gravity without fully understanding it. Young David Thornberry pushed through the crowd, his face pale with shock and something that might have been disbelief. "Uncle Reggie?" he called out, as if the familiar nickname might somehow summon life back into the still form. But he was just... "We were talking this afternoon about the quarterly accounts. He seemed perfectly well." Miss Patricia Wells moved to David's side with the instinctive compassion of someone accustomed to comforting others, her hand finding his arm in a gesture that did not go unnoticed by several of the village's more observant residents, including Miss Marple. "Heart attack, was it?" asked Mr. Fletcher, the village baker, his voice carrying the practical concern of a man who had reached an age where such possibilities weighed heavily on his mind. Dr. Pembridge hesitated, and that moment of uncertainty hung in the air like smoke. "It's difficult to say without a proper examination. These things can happen quite suddenly, but—" He glanced toward the overturned lantern, then back to the crowd. "We should contact the authorities. In cases of sudden death, especially in public circumstances, there are procedures that must be followed." This pronouncement sent a ripple of unease through the gathered villagers. Procedures suggested investigations, and investigations suggested that something might be amiss beyond the simple tragedy of a man dying at his community's celebration. "Someone should telephone Constable Sims," declared Mrs. Ashford, though her voice lacked its usual postmistress authority. Miss Marple noticed that the envelope Mrs. Ashford had been clutching throughout the evening was no longer in her hands, though she couldn't recall seeing the woman dispose of it. "I'll go," offered young Tommy Fletcher, eager for importance, but Dr. Pembridge shook his head. "Best if Mrs. Ashford makes the call. She'll know the proper procedures." The doctor's tone brooked no argument, and Mrs. Ashford hurried toward the village hall where the telephone resided. Miss Marple rose from her bench with careful deliberation, gathering her knitting and moving closer to observe the scene more clearly. From this new vantage point, she could see details that confirmed her growing suspicions. The great lantern lay on its side, but there was something about its position that struck her as significant. It had not simply fallen when Mr. Thornberry collapsed. It had been set down with the careful precision of someone who didn't want to damage a valuable antique, even in the midst of crisis. More intriguingly, she noticed that the small thumb screw that should secure the brass lid had been turned the wrong way round, as if someone left-handed, or merely unfamiliar with the mechanism, had tightened it. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that small things often carried the greatest significance. "Excuse me, Doctor," she said in her gentle, apologetic manner, "but I couldn't help noticing that peculiar smell earlier, just before poor Mr. Thornberry was taken ill. Rather sweet and chemical-like. I do hope it wasn't something dangerous that might affect the rest of us." Dr. Pembridge's eyes met hers across the crowd, and she saw in them the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else who had noticed things that didn't quite fit. "I hadn't noticed any unusual odors," he said carefully. "But you're quite right to be concerned about public safety. Perhaps everyone should move back a bit further." As the crowd began to disperse slightly, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the various reactions unfolding around her. The village was already beginning to process this tragedy in its own particular way, with gossip and speculation flowing like water, finding its natural course. "Poor Mr. Thornbury, just like that," Mrs. Larkins was saying to anyone who would listen. "He always worked too hard, you know. His heart, I expect. These sudden attacks, they run in families sometimes." "Did you see the way he looked at the lantern, though?" whispered Mrs. Plumtree, the baker's wife, almost as if he knew something was wrong with it. "And that smell Miss Marple mentioned, I noticed it too, now that I think of it." Near the refreshment tent, Reverend Hartwell stood with his hands clasped, his face a mask of distress. Miss Marple observed that he kept reaching for his jacket pocket, then stopping himself, as if remembering that whatever he sought was no longer there. The small piece of paper he had been checking throughout the evening had vanished, and his nervous energy suggested this was not a casual loss. When Constable Sims arrived on his bicycle, his buttons gleaming and his breath making clouds in the cooling air, he immediately began the process of securing the scene. Miss Marple watched with interest as he questioned, Dr. Pembridge noting the way the doctor's responses were carefully measured. Professional, yet somehow incomplete. "Right then," the constable announced to the crowd, consulting his notebook with the gravity of a man unused to such responsibility. "I'll need statements from everyone who was near when Mr. Thornbury collapsed. Just routine, you understand, but we must do things properly." As Constable Sims began taking names and positions, Miss Marple noticed two young boys, Tommy Fletcher and his friend Ned Lark, hovering at the edge of the crowd, their eyes wide with the terrible fascination that children feel for dramatic events. "Tommy," she called gently, "you were quite near when the lantern went out, weren't you? Did you see anyone close to it before Mr. Thornbury lit it?" Tommy looked at his friend, then at his shoes, then back at Miss Marple with the trust that children instinctively placed in her. "There was someone looked at it, miss," he said after a moment's consideration. "A bit before the ceremony started. I saw a black sleeve and a hand like. Only just for a moment, then gone." "A hand?" Miss Marple encouraged gently. "With a ring," Ned blurted, then looked as if he regretted speaking. "Big ring it was, shiny." Miss Marple nodded as if they had told her something perfectly ordinary. "Thank you, my dears. How very observant you are." She made a mental note that there were at least 3 men in the village who wore heavy rings. Mr. Thornbury himself had worn a family signet. Mr. Pike from the Hare and Plough sported what he called his club memento. And she had noticed that Dr. Pembridge wore a simple gold band, though not particularly heavy. As the evening progressed and statements were taken, Miss Marple observed the subtle currents of tension flowing through the crowd. David Thornbury remained close to his uncle's body, his grief genuine but complicated by what appeared to be anxiety about practical matters. Patricia Wells had withdrawn slightly, her earlier warmth replaced by a careful reserve that suggested she was reconsidering her position in the village's social structure now that circumstances had changed so dramatically. Mrs. Ashford returned from making her telephone calls, announcing that Inspector Craddock would arrive first thing in the morning to conduct a proper investigation. Her hands were now empty, Miss Marple noted, and she seemed careful not to look directly at anyone in particular, as if afraid her eyes might betray some knowledge she preferred to keep private. The paper lanterns continued their gentle dance in the evening breeze as the crowd gradually began to thin, people returning to their homes with the unsettling knowledge that death had visited their celebration. But Miss Marple remained, ostensibly gathering her knitting, but actually studying the scene with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most important clues often revealed themselves only when the initial drama had subsided. The great lantern lay silent in the grass, its brass fittings gleaming dully in the remaining light. Whatever secrets it held, and Miss Marple was increasingly certain it held several, would have to wait for daylight and more careful examination. But already, patterns were beginning to emerge in her mind, connections forming between observed behaviors and half-heard conversations, between what people said and what they so carefully avoided saying. In her long experience, she had learned that murder, like village life itself, was rarely as simple as it first appeared. Someone in Little Wickham had used the cover of tradition and celebration to commit what they believed would be the perfect crime. But as Miss Marple settled her knitting in her basket and prepared to walk home through the lamp-lit lanes, she reflected that there was no such thing as a perfect crime, only crimes whose imperfections had not yet been properly observed. The festival was over, but the real investigation was just beginning. The morning light that filtered through Little Wickham's ancient oak trees carried with it an unnatural stillness, as if the village itself held its breath in the aftermath of tragedy. Miss Marple emerged from her cottage shortly after 7, drawn by that peculiar compulsion that follows dramatic events, the need to see familiar places transformed by extraordinary circumstances. The village green, which had sparkled with lantern light mere hours before, now appeared almost stark in the pale September sunshine, save for the overturned great lantern lying like a fallen sentinel beside the war memorial. She was not alone in her early pilgrimage. Dr. Pembridge stood near the bandstand, his medical bag clutched tightly, studying the scene with the methodical attention of someone whose professional reputation might depend upon the answers he found there. When he noticed Miss Marple's approach, his relief was evident. Here was someone whose discretion could be trusted and whose observations had proved valuable in the past. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, touching his hat in greeting. "I confess I've been here since dawn, trying to make sense of what happened. Mr. Thornbury was in excellent health when I examined him last month. Strong heart, clear lungs, no indication whatsoever of any condition that might cause sudden collapse." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her keen eyes moving from the doctor's troubled face to the fallen lantern. "How very puzzling for you, Doctor. That unusual chemical odor I mentioned. Have you given any consideration to what might have caused such a thing?" Before Dr. Pembridge could respond, the sound of a motorcar approaching interrupted their conversation. Inspector Craddock's black Austin came to a halt beside the green, followed by Constable Sims on his bicycle, both men bringing with them the brisk efficiency of official investigation. Inspector Craddock emerged from his vehicle with the measured pace of someone accustomed to examining scenes of sudden death, though his expression suggested this particular case had already presented more questions than routine inquiries typically generated. "Dr. Pembridge, Miss Marple." The inspector acknowledged them both with professional courtesy. "I understand you were first to attend Mr. Thornbury last evening, Doctor?" "Indeed. I pronounced death at approximately 8:15, though I believe he had expired several minutes earlier." Dr. Pembridge's voice carried the weight of professional responsibility. "The circumstances were highly unusual, Inspector. The symptoms, sudden disorientation, brief convulsions, then complete collapse, are not consistent with typical cardiac failure." Inspector Craddock knelt beside the great lantern, his trained eyes taking in details that casual observers might miss. Miss Marple watched with interest as he noted the position of the brass top, the way it had been carefully set aside rather than dropped, and the peculiar manner in which the thumbscrew had been turned. The metal bore a fresh scratch, as if someone unfamiliar with the mechanism had forced it the wrong direction. "Has anyone disturbed this since last evening?" Inspector Craddock inquired, though his tone suggested he suspected the answer. "Only myself when attempting to assist Mr. Thornbury," Dr. Pembridge replied. "I was careful not to interfere with anything unnecessarily." Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "Inspector, the Fletcher boys mentioned seeing someone near the lantern before the ceremony began. They noticed a hand wearing what they described as a large, shiny ring, though they couldn't identify the person." Inspector Craddock made careful notes, then continued his examination. Miss Marple observed that he spent considerable time studying the grass around the lantern's base, where a faint discoloration suggested something had been spilled and quickly absorbed. The sweet, chemical smell she had detected the previous evening still lingered faintly, though it was dissipating in the morning air. "Constable Sims," Inspector Craddock instructed. "I want this entire area cordoned off properly. No one approaches without my permission." He straightened, brushing grass from his knees. "And arrange interviews with everyone who was present last evening, starting with family members and those closest to the deceased when he collapsed." As Constable Sims departed on his bicycle, David Thornbury appeared at the edge of the green, walking with the careful gait of someone carrying an enormous burden. His clothes were rumpled, suggesting he had not returned home, and his face bore the hollow look of a man who had spent the night wrestling with grief and its implications. "Inspector," David called as he approached, "there's something I should mention, though I'm uncertain of its significance. Uncle Reggie had been receiving anonymous letters recently, unpleasant suggestions about business irregularities. He claimed they were nonsense, but they disturbed him considerably." Inspector Craddock's attention sharpened immediately. "Do these letters still exist?" "That's the peculiar thing. Uncle Reggie said he'd burned them all last week, yet yesterday afternoon I saw him reading something that made him quite angry. He folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, muttering about settling matters once and for all." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Craddock. "David, dear, did your uncle still have this document with him at the festival?" David frowned, concentrating. "I don't believe so. When Dr. Pembridge and I moved him, I would certainly have noticed papers in his pockets. His wallet, watch and keys were there, but no letters or documents of any kind." This revelation cast the previous evening's events in an entirely different light. If someone had removed correspondence from Mr. Thornbury's person, either before or immediately after his collapse, it suggested premeditation rather than a crime of opportunity. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the various comings and goings around the green. Mrs. Ashford emerged from the post office with unusual haste, her eyes carefully avoiding the area where Mr. Thornbury had fallen. Reverend Hartwell appeared briefly, offering his services to both the family and the investigation, but his nervous energy from the previous evening had intensified rather than diminished with daylight. Most intriguingly, Patricia Wells had stationed herself at the school garden, ostensibly tending to late-blooming flowers, but clearly observing the proceedings. Her attention seemed focused not on Inspector Craddock's investigation, but on David Thornbury's responses to questioning, as if evaluating how his answers might affect her own circumstances. The pieces of this puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in Miss Marple's mind, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Someone in Little Wickham had transformed beloved tradition into deadly opportunity, believing that festival chaos and assumptions of natural death would provide perfect concealment. But murderers, in her extensive experience, consistently underestimated both the power of careful observation and the tendency of secrets to surface under pressure. The morning's official investigation began with Inspector Craddock establishing his temporary headquarters in the village hall's committee room, a space that had witnessed countless parish debates but never anything approaching the gravity of a murder inquiry. Miss Marple, understanding the value of strategic positioning, settled herself in the adjacent tea shop with her knitting, where the large window provided an excellent view of comings and goings, while her presence appeared entirely innocent. Inspector Craddock's first formal interview was with David Thornbury, whose hollow-eyed appearance suggested a sleepless night, wrestling with grief and its implications. Through the thin walls of the village hall, Miss Marple could hear fragments of their conversation. David's voice strained as he described the anonymous letters that had been troubling his uncle in recent weeks. "Increasingly vicious," she heard him say. "Accusations about business practices. Suggestions of moral failings. Uncle Reggie claimed he'd burned them all, but yesterday I saw him reading something that made him absolutely furious. He folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, muttering about settling matters once and for all." This revelation about missing correspondence struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. In her experience, documents that vanished from crime scenes rarely did so by accident. When David emerged from his interview, his agitation was evident to anyone who cared to observe. He walked directly to the churchyard where Patricia Wells waited beneath the ancient yew, and their brief, intense conversation was punctuated by gestures that suggested disagreement about some course of action. Meanwhile, the forensic examination of the great lantern was yielding intriguing results. Inspector Craddock had noted the peculiar way the brass thumbscrew had been turned, forced in the wrong direction as if by someone unfamiliar with the mechanism, or perhaps someone left-handed attempting to operate a device designed for right-handed use. The faint chemical residue that had produced that sweet, medicinal odor was being carefully collected for analysis, though Miss Marple suspected the results would confirm what Dr. Pembridge's carefully neutral responses had already suggested. Dr. Pembridge's interview was brief and professionally precise, yet Miss Marple observed something telling in his demeanor afterward. When he thought himself unobserved, his hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket, checking for something that was either present or conspicuously absent. His medical bag, which he rarely carried to social functions, had remained firmly attached to his side since the previous evening, a detail that might mean nothing or everything. Mrs. Ashford's interview lasted considerably longer, and when she finally emerged from the village hall, her usual postmistress composure had cracked sufficiently to reveal genuine distress beneath. Miss Marple noted that her hands, steady enough to sort the village correspondence for 20 years, now trembled visibly as she attempted to light a cigarette. More significantly, Mrs. Ashford made a brief stop at the telephone box, a conversation lasting exactly 3 minutes that left her looking even more agitated than before. The afternoon's most revealing interview involved Reverend Hartwell, whose nervous energy from the previous evening had intensified rather than diminished with daylight. Unlike the others who had approached their interviews with varying degrees of reluctance, the Reverend's step carried an almost eager quality, as if he welcomed the opportunity to unburden himself. His interview lasted nearly an hour, during which Miss Marple observed Inspector Craddock's silhouette through the hall's windows, leaning forward with the intense attention of someone receiving significant information. When Reverend Hartwell finally emerged, his face bore an expression of profound relief mixed with what might have been shame. Miss Marple made particular note of his black sleeve, remembering the Fletcher boy's description of a hand with a shiny ring near the lantern. She had observed that the Reverend wore his watch on his right wrist and bore an ink stain along his left forefinger, suggesting left-handed writing habits. More intriguingly, she noticed a small, translucent smear on his cuff that might have been brass polish, lamp oil, or something else entirely. The anonymous letters had become a central focus of the investigation, particularly after Inspector Craddock's visit to Thornbury House revealed that Mr. Thornbury's correspondence drawer had been recently disturbed. A faint rectangular outline in the dust suggested something had been removed, while a tiny crescent of blackened wick on the windowsill indicated the great lantern had been serviced there recently. The discovery that Reverend Hartwell held a key to the vestry, where the lantern was stored, along with Mr. Pike's informal access as acting parish clerk, opened new avenues of inquiry. As the formal interviews concluded, Miss Marple observed the various participants' behavior with the patient attention of someone who understood that guilt often revealed itself in the smallest gestures. David Thornbury walked toward the family business with the heavy step of a man bearing unwanted inheritance. Patricia Wells returned to the school, her usual confidence replaced by careful movements that suggested she was reconsidering her position in the village's social hierarchy. Dr. Pembridge made an unusual detour to the edge of the village, standing on the old Roman road as if wrestling with some internal debate before returning with apparent resolution. When Inspector Craddock finally emerged from the village hall, his expression suggested he had collected more puzzle pieces than expected, though their arrangement remained elusive. His approach to Miss Marple in the tea shop carried the respect he had learned to show for her observations. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I don't suppose you've noticed anything that might shed light on this business?" Miss Marple set down her knitting with careful precision. "Inspector, I've been thinking about that peculiar chemical smell from last evening. In my experience, such odors are often associated with chloroform or similar medical preparations. Dr. Pembridge would naturally have access to such substances, though of course, so might others with different reasons for possessing them." Inspector Craddock leaned forward with interest. "The question that troubles me is how the poison was administered. Mr. Thornbury ate and drank nothing during the ceremony itself." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the poison wasn't something he consumed, but something he handled. The great lantern, for instance, would have required his direct contact to operate properly. A substance applied to the brass fittings would be absorbed through the skin, particularly if the victim had small cuts or abrasions on his hands." This observation crystallized something in Inspector Craddock's mind, and he rose abruptly, thanking Miss Marple before striding back toward the green where evidence awaited more thorough examination. As she watched him go, Miss Marple reflected that while the investigation was proceeding methodically, the real truth lay not in the physical evidence alone, but in understanding which of Little Wickham's residents possessed both the knowledge to commit such a crime and the desperate motive to risk everything on a single, deadly gamble during their most cherished community celebration. Inspector Craddock's renewed examination of the great lantern, guided by Miss Marple's insight about contact poison, transformed speculation into grim certainty. Under careful scrutiny with his magnifying glass and wearing protective gloves borrowed from Dr. Pembridge's medical bag, the brass thumbscrew revealed traces of a waxy, translucent residue that caught the afternoon light with an oily sheen. The substance retained that distinctive sweet, medicinal odor Miss Marple had detected, confirming her theory that Mr. Thornbury had been poisoned through skin contact rather than ingestion. The discovery sent ripples of unease through Little Wickham as word spread with the inexorable efficiency of village gossip. By tea-time, every resident knew their beloved patriarch had been deliberately murdered, and suspicion settled over the community like morning fog, touching everyone while obscuring clear vision. Miss Marple observed this transformation from her strategic position in the tea shop, noting how relationships that had seemed solid the previous evening now appeared fragile under the weight of mutual distrust. David Thornbury's second interview with Inspector Craddock yielded information that cast the entire investigation in a more sinister light. When pressed about the anonymous letters, David's composure cracked slightly. "Uncle Reggie was furious about yesterday's letter, Inspector. He wouldn't show it to me, but he muttered something about blackmail and a desperate attempt to ruin him. He said the author was someone close, someone he had trusted, and that he intended to confront them at the festival." This revelation of planned confrontation suggested the murder had been committed to prevent exposure rather than for financial gain alone. Inspector Craddock immediately focused on the missing correspondence. "You're certain this letter wasn't on his person after he collapsed?" "Absolutely certain," David insisted, his voice tight with strain. "I helped Dr. Pembridge move him. His pockets contained only his wallet, watch, and keys. No papers whatsoever." The afternoon brought an unexpected development when young Tommy Fletcher approached Inspector Craddock with additional information his conscience had finally compelled him to share. The boy had remembered that whoever handled the lantern had worn gloves, unusual for such a warm evening, and had disposed of them immediately afterward in the waste bin beside the refreshment tent. Inspector Craddock's search of the waste bin yielded a pair of thin leather gloves, expensive quality and bearing faint traces of the same waxy residue found on the lantern's thumbscrew. The gloves were sized for small hands, which eliminated several suspects but raised new questions about others. Miss Marple noted that both Mrs. Ashford and Patricia Wells possessed delicate hands that would fit such gloves, though Dr. Pembridge, despite his profession, had surprisingly slender fingers for a man. The preliminary laboratory report, delivered by telephone from the county facility, confirmed the presence of a fast-acting neurotoxin on the brass fittings. The poison was virtually colorless and odorless in small quantities, but when heated by the lantern's flame, it would have vaporized slightly, producing the faint chemical smell Miss Marple had detected. More significantly, traces of the same substance were found on Mr. Thornberry's right hand, consistent with dermal absorption during the lighting ceremony. Dr. Pembridge's reaction to this forensic evidence was carefully controlled, yet Miss Marple detected subtle signs of strain beneath his professional composure. When Inspector Craddock questioned him about access to such substances, the doctor's responses were precisely measured. "As a physician, I'm aware of various compounds, Inspector. However, agricultural suppliers also stock potent chemicals, nicotine solutions for pest control, degreasing compounds for farm machinery. Thornberry and Sons sells such products to every small holding for 15 miles. This observation opened new avenues of investigation while deflecting attention from medical sources. Miss Marple found it interesting that Dr. Pembridge would so readily suggest alternative suppliers, particularly when those alternatives pointed toward the victim's own business. Mrs. Ashford's increasing agitation throughout the day had not gone unnoticed. Her hurried telephone call after the morning's interviews, combined with the mysterious envelope she had been clutching during the festival, suggested deeper involvement than mere postal duties. When David Thornberry confronted her outside the post office, their heated exchange, conducted in voices too low to carry, but with gestures urgent enough to be visible, ended with David storming away and Mrs. Ashford collapsing into her chair with obvious distress. Reverend Hartwell's second interview with Inspector Craddock proved equally revealing. The nervous clergyman admitted to handling the lantern during the afternoon, claiming he had straightened its wick mechanism after noticing it sat askew. His left-handed movements would explain the peculiar way the thumbscrew had been turned, and the translucent smear on his cuff could indeed be brass polish from the cleaning supplies Mr. Pike had brought to the vestry. More significantly, Reverend Hartwell revealed that Mr. Thornberry had threatened to propose a review of his position to the parish council, citing the need for modern efficiency in church leadership. The Reverend's obvious relief after his interview suggested he had unburdened himself of significant information, though whether this constituted confession or merely explanation remained unclear. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the patterns emerging from the day's revelations. The poison required both specialized knowledge and access to dangerous substances, while the method of delivery demonstrated intimate familiarity with village traditions and Mr. Thornberry's personal habits. The blackmail motive suggested someone with access to damaging information about the victim, while the careful removal of evidence indicated premeditation and sang-froid under pressure. The combination of these factors pointed towards someone who moved freely within Little Wycombe's social circles, possessed either medical or agricultural knowledge, and harbored secrets desperate enough to kill for. Miss Marple understood that the investigation was approaching its critical phase, where careful observation of human behavior would prove more valuable than forensic evidence in identifying the murderer among their seemingly ordinary neighbors. The morning's investigation had established the method of murder, but Inspector Craddock's afternoon inquiries revealed a web of motives more complex than anyone had initially suspected. Armed with the forensic evidence of contact poison and the peculiar reversal of the lantern's thumbscrew, he began methodically examining each suspect's access, opportunity, and reason for wanting Mr. Thornberry dead. Miss Marple, maintaining her strategic position in the tea shop, observed the subtle shifts in village dynamics as secrets long buried began surfacing under investigative pressure. The breakthrough came when Inspector Craddock examined the parish typewriter in Reverend Hartwell's study. The machine's capital R sat a millimeter too high, creating a distinctive flaw that matched perfectly with fragments of the anonymous letters Mrs. Ashford had preserved. When confronted with this evidence, the nervous clergyman's composure finally cracked completely. "Yes, I typed those letters," Reverend Hartwell admitted, his hands trembling as he removed his spectacles to clean them repeatedly. "But I never intended murder, Inspector. Mr. Thornbury was systematically destroying people's lives with his financial manipulations and moral blackmail. Someone had to expose his true character before he ruined more families." The Reverend's confession revealed the scope of Mr. Thornbury's control over the village. Using his position as both prominent businessman and parish council chairman, Thornbury had been gathering compromising information about residents and using it to advance his interests. The anonymous letters were Reverend Hartwell's attempt to fight back against what he saw as systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. He discovered that Mrs. Ashford had borrowed from church funds years ago during her mother's illness. The Reverend explained, his voice gaining strength through confession. Instead of handling it quietly through proper channels, he used it as leverage to ensure her cooperation in his schemes. He did the same with others. Mr. Pike's gambling debts, Patricia Wells' relationship with David, even my own inexperience with parish finances. Mrs. Ashford's subsequent interview confirmed this pattern of manipulation. The envelope she had clutched during the festival contained Mr. Thornbury's ultimatum regarding her long-ago financial transgression. He said he would announce my crime after the lantern ceremony, unless I agreed to help him acquire the post office building for his expansion plans. She sobbed, producing the threatening note from her apron pocket. 20 years of faithful service, and he would have destroyed my reputation over money I fully intended to repay. Inspector Craddock's examination of the post office revealed additional evidence of Thornbury's schemes. Hidden behind routine correspondence were copies of letters detailing his systematic pressure on various villagers. He had been building a network of control, using people's secrets and vulnerabilities to consolidate power and eliminate opposition to his business ambitions. The investigation of Mr. Pike at the Hare and Plough yielded equally damning information. The landlord's heavy silver ring matched the children's description perfectly, and his access to the vestry as acting parish clerk provided ample opportunity to tamper with the great lantern. Thornbury was trying to force me out, Pike admitted bitterly, his ring catching the afternoon light as he gestured. Said the pub was a blight on village character and threatened to expose my gambling debts unless I sold to him at a fraction of fair value. More significantly, Pike revealed that he had seen someone else near the lantern during the afternoon preparations. Dr. Pembridge was there when I finished cleaning it, wearing gloves and examining the mechanism quite carefully. Said he was checking that everything was properly maintained for the ceremony, but it struck me as odd behavior for a medical man. Dr. Pembridge's renewed questioning revealed the final piece of the motive puzzle. The doctor's professional composure cracked when confronted with Pike's testimony and the evidence of his presence near the lantern. Thornbury had discovered my difficulties with laudanum, he admitted quietly, his medical bag clutched protectively against his side. A physician's dependency on his own medicines is a career-ending scandal. He threatened to report me to the medical board unless I certified false health reports for his insurance schemes. The scope of Thornbury's blackmail network was staggering. He had systematically identified and exploited the vulnerabilities of nearly every prominent villager, creating a web of control that ensured his dominance over Little Wycombe's social and economic life. Each victim had compelling motive for murder, and several possessed the knowledge and opportunity to commit the crime. Patricia Wells's nervous energy throughout the investigation now made perfect sense. Her relationship with David Thornbury, while genuine, had provided his uncle with leverage over both young people. The missing gloves found in the waste bin bore traces of the same lavender scent that permeated the school supply closet, while chalk dust in the empty glove loops on her coat suggested hasty disposal of evidence. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple synthesized these revelations with her own careful observations. The crime required intimate knowledge of the lantern's mechanism, access to sophisticated poison, and the sang-froid to remove evidence under public scrutiny. While multiple suspects possessed strong motives, only one had demonstrated the combination of medical knowledge, opportunity, and calculated behavior necessary for such a precisely executed murder. The pattern was becoming clear to her methodical mind. Someone had used the festival's chaos and the obvious suspects' vulnerabilities to commit what they believed would be the perfect crime. The reversed thumbscrew, the small gloves, even the timing of the anonymous letters, all were carefully orchestrated to create confusion and deflect suspicion from the true perpetrator. Inspector Craddock's investigation had revealed the depth of corruption beneath Little Wickham's placid surface, but Miss Marple understood that exposing motive was only half the battle. The real challenge lay in proving which of the many potential murderers had possessed both the opportunity and the ruthless calculation to transform village tradition into deadly trap. As evening approached, she reflected that the investigation was entering its most critical phase, where careful observation of human behavior would prove more valuable than forensic evidence in identifying the killer among their seemingly ordinary neighbors. The morning following Inspector Craddock's revelations about Mr. Thornbury's extensive blackmail network brought an uneasy quiet to Little Wickham, as if the village itself was holding its breath before the next inevitable shock. Miss Marple observed from her cottage window how neighbors who had greeted each other warmly for decades now passed with cautious nods, each wondering what secrets the investigation might expose next. The scope of Thornbury's manipulation had shaken everyone's sense of security, creating an atmosphere where trust seemed as fragile as autumn leaves. Dr. Pembridge moved through his morning rounds with mechanical precision, his usual warmth replaced by the careful neutrality of someone whose professional reputation hung by a thread. His admission about laudanum dependency had been damaging enough, but Miss Marple noticed how his hands trembled slightly when he thought himself unobserved, suggesting deeper anxieties than mere addiction concerns. David Thornbury had spent the night at Patricia Wells' cottage, ostensibly for comfort, but perhaps also for strategic consultation, their relationship now complicated by the investigation's scrutiny of everyone connected to the victim. The fragile morning calm shattered completely when Mrs. Higgins's terrified screams echoed from the direction of the post office just before noon. Miss Marple, who had been tending her garden while keeping a watchful eye on village activities, immediately recognized the particular quality of genuine shock in those cries. She gathered her knitting bag with practiced efficiency and made her way toward the commotion, arriving to find Inspector Craddock already examining the scene with professional thoroughness. Mrs. Ashford's cottage presented a tableau of deliberate chaos that immediately struck Miss Marple as peculiar in its very thoroughness. Drawers had been pulled out and their contents scattered across the floors, cushions torn from furniture, and papers strewn about with what appeared to be desperate urgency. Yet several details troubled her methodical mind. The cottage's valuable silver tea service remained untouched on its prominent shelf, while a collection of antique porcelain figurines sat undisturbed despite their obvious worth and portability. Mrs. Ashford herself huddled in her kitchen chair, clutching a teacup with hands that shook genuinely enough, though Miss Marple detected something rehearsed in her distress. "They took it, Inspector," she wailed with convincing anguish. "Mr. Thornbury's letter about the church funds, the one that proved what a monster he truly was. Someone wanted to silence me before I could show it to you." Inspector Craddock's examination revealed that entry had been gained through the back window, which overlooked a narrow lane accessible only on foot. The window frame showed clear pry marks, and the ground below had been carefully swept to remove any incriminating footprints. Inside, the ransacking appeared focused primarily on areas where documents might be stored, though the thoroughness seemed almost theatrical in its completeness. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the physical evidence and the human reactions surrounding it. The broken lock on Mrs. Ashford's writing desk particularly caught her attention. A small brass key lay nearby on the floor, still attached to its keyring, clearly capable of opening the desk without force. Why break what could be easily unlocked unless the destruction itself served a purpose beyond mere access? More subtly, she detected a faint chemical scent lingering beneath the cottage's usual lavender and old paper smells. It wasn't the sweet medicinal odor from the poisoned lantern, but something sharper and cleaner, reminiscent of the antiseptic solutions used in medical practices, or perhaps the cleaning compounds employed in schools. The smell seemed concentrated near the writing desk, as if whoever had staged this scene had brought traces of their regular environment with them. The immediate effect of the break-in was to shift suspicion dramatically toward the other blackmail victims. Constable Sims openly speculated about Mr. Pike's gambling desperation, while several villagers whispered about Dr. Pembridge's potential for desperate measures given his laudanum problems. David Thornbury found himself under renewed scrutiny, as Mrs. Ashford's letter could potentially damage what remained of his family's reputation. Miss Marple, however, recognized the break-in's true purpose with growing clarity. This was not the desperate act of a cornered blackmail victim, but rather a carefully orchestrated diversion designed to muddy the investigative waters. The theatrical nature of the destruction, the convenient timing following the previous day's revelations, and the surgical precision with which only specific items had been targeted all pointed to calculation rather than panic. As Inspector Craddock questioned the neighbors about suspicious activities, Miss Marple made her own quiet inquiries. Young Tommy Fletcher mentioned seeing someone near the cottage's back lane around dawn, moving carefully rather than hurriedly and carrying what looked like a small bundle. Mrs. Plumtree from the bakery recalled hearing the cottage's back gate creak unusually early, followed by complete silence that seemed somehow deliberate. The investigation of this new crime consumed the afternoon, providing exactly the distraction the perpetrator had undoubtedly intended. While Inspector Craddock focused on identifying which blackmail victim might have committed this secondary offense, Miss Marple understood that the real murderer was using the chaos to consolidate their position and eliminate remaining evidence. Patricia Wells's reaction to news of the break-in proved particularly telling. Her immediate concern seemed focused not on Mrs. Ashford's welfare, but on how this development might affect David's situation. When she thought herself unobserved, her hand moved instinctively to her jacket pocket, checking for something that was either present or notably absent. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events with the patient analysis that had served her so well in previous investigations. Someone in Little Wickham possessed both the intelligence to orchestrate such elaborate deceptions and the ruthless calculation to use their neighbors' vulnerabilities as camouflage for murder. The break-in had been expertly staged to reinforce the narrative of desperate blackmail victims while deflecting attention from the true killer's methodical elimination of evidence. Tomorrow, she decided, would require more direct action. The time for passive observation was ending, and the moment was approaching when careful questions and deliberate tests would force the murderer to reveal themselves through the very cleverness they believed protected them. The morning after the staged break-in brought Miss Marple to a decisive moment in her investigation. She had observed enough, gathered sufficient threads of evidence, and now understood that the time for passive watching had ended. The murderer's confidence was growing with each successful misdirection, but Miss Marple knew from long experience that overconfidence often led to the very mistakes that exposed guilt most clearly. Her first stop was the church vestry, where she found Inspector Craddock examining the great lantern with renewed interest following the previous day's dramatic developments. "Inspector," she said with gentle authority, "I wonder if I might suggest a small experiment. Something rather domestic, but sometimes those prove most illuminating." With his curious agreement, Miss Marple withdrew a small piece of white chalk from her knitting bag, explaining apologetically that she wished to set what she called a little telltale. She rubbed the chalk along the inner edge of the lantern's brass top, creating an invisible mark that would transfer to any fingers that opened the mechanism. "If someone feels compelled to return and tidy up their earlier work," she explained with quiet satisfaction, "we shall know of it immediately." More importantly, she arranged for word to spread through the village's efficient gossip network that Inspector Craddock intended to examine the lantern mechanism again that afternoon. having discovered that Mr. Thornbury had made notes about it on the day of his death. The suggestion that evidence might still be hidden within the device was carefully planted through conversations with Mrs. Larkins at the grocer's and Mrs. Plumtree at the bakery, allowing natural village curiosity to carry the information where it needed to go. Miss Marple then positioned herself strategically in the tea shop, from where she could observe the church and its surroundings while appearing to focus entirely on her knitting. The morning passed quietly until just after 11, when she noticed Patricia Wells leaving the schoolhouse with the purposeful stride of someone fitting an urgent errand into a tight schedule. The young teacher's path led directly toward the church, though she took care to approach from the side rather than the main entrance. Through the tea shop window, Miss Marple watched as Patricia glanced around carefully before slipping into the vestry through the side door that Constable Sims had inadvertently left unlatched during his earlier rounds. The visit lasted less than 3 minutes, but when Patricia emerged, her composure had shifted subtly. Her right hand was clenched as if warming cold fingers, and her usual confident bearing had been replaced by something more cautious, more watchful. When Patricia noticed Miss Marple observing from the tea shop window, she produced a smile that seemed almost too ready. "Miss Marple? How lovely to see you. I was just arranging some flowers for this afternoon's memorial service." But Miss Marple's sharp eyes had already noted the faint, powdery residue on Patricia's sleeve, chalk dust that hadn't been there when she'd left the school. The afternoon brought Inspector Craddock's promised examination of the lantern, conducted with Miss Marple present as a witness. The chalk trap had worked perfectly, revealing fresh fingerprints on the inner mechanism where someone had attempted to remove the last traces of the waxy poison residue. More tellingly, a minute crumb of the same substance had been caught in a fold of the vestry table's cloth, brushed there by hasty, nervous fingers. Armed with this physical evidence, Miss Marple made her final, decisive move. She called upon Patricia at the schoolhouse just as the children were being dismissed for their afternoon break, timing her visit to catch the young woman in a moment of routine vulnerability before the protective barriers of teaching responsibilities could be erected. "My dear Patricia," Miss Marple began with characteristic gentleness, settling herself in one of the small student chairs, "I've been thinking about that distinctive lavender scent you favor. It's quite memorable, and I noticed it particularly near Mrs. Ashford's writing desk yesterday morning." Patricia's reaction was immediate and telling. Her hand moved instinctively toward her jacket pocket before she caught herself, and a faint flush colored her cheeks. "It's just a sachet I keep with my supplies," she replied with careful casualness, but her voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments before. Miss Marple continued her gentle interrogation, commenting on the theatrical nature of the break-in, the convenient disappearance of evidence, and the remarkable precision with which only specific items had been targeted. With each observation, Patricia's composure eroded further, her carefully maintained facade beginning to crack under the relentless pressure of seemingly innocent conversation. The final blow came when Miss Marple mentioned the peculiar way the lantern's thumbscrew had been turned, as if by someone left-handed, and the small scratch left by a ring, not a heavy signet, but something more delicate, like a wedding band. Patricia's eyes widened with unmistakable panic as her hand flew instinctively to cover her left ring finger, the gesture betraying her completely. "The children will be needing supervision," Patricia stammered, backing toward the door, but Miss Marple's gentle voice stopped her with inexorable authority. "I think, my dear, that it's time we had a proper conversation about what really happened at the Harvest Lantern Festival. Don't you?" In that moment, surrounded by the innocent chaos of a village classroom, Patricia Wells realized that her carefully constructed deception had finally met its match in the quiet, relentless observation of an elderly lady who understood that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable. Patricia's back pressed against the classroom door as Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable questioning stripped away the carefully constructed facade she had maintained since the festival. The young teacher's eyes darted around the familiar space, past the children's artwork on the walls, the neat rows of desks, the blackboard where she had written lessons that morning, as if seeking refuge in the normalcy of her professional world. But there was no escape from the quiet, methodical voice that had already identified too many inconsistencies to ignore. "My dear," Miss Marple continued, rising from the small chair with deliberate care, "I think we both understand that this conversation has moved beyond mere speculation. The chalk dust on your sleeve from this morning's visit to the vestry, the faint lavender scent that has lingered near every piece of evidence, the absence of that delicate ring you usually wear, these are not coincidences, are they?" Patricia's hand flew instinctively to her left ring finger, confirming Miss Marple's observation with the very gesture meant to conceal it. The simple gold band that had adorned her hand throughout the investigation was conspicuously absent, likely removed when she realized it matched the children's description of the shiny ring they had glimpsed near the lantern. "You don't understand the position I was in," Patricia whispered, her voice breaking as she sank into her teacher's chair. "Mr. Thornbury wasn't just threatening David's inheritance or my reputation. He had discovered things, personal matters, that could have destroyed both our futures entirely." Miss Marple settled herself across from Patricia with the patient attention of someone who had heard many confessions over the years. "Tell me about these personal matters, my dear. In my experience, the truth is often less damaging than the fear of its revelation." The story emerged in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle Patricia had been desperately trying to keep scattered. Mr. Thornbury had indeed discovered her relationship with David, but more damaging still was his knowledge of certain academic irregularities Patricia had committed out of misguided compassion. A struggling student from an influential family, examination papers subtly adjusted to prevent a child's separation from his parents. Small kindnesses that Thornbury had transformed into weapons of control. "He was going to expose everything," Patricia continued, her professional composure crumbling entirely. "My position, David's reputation, our plans for the future, all of it would have been destroyed, and he took such pleasure in the threat, such satisfaction in watching people squirm under his power." Miss Marple nodded with understanding while maintaining her steady, questioning gaze. "And so you decided that the Harvest Lantern Festival would provide the perfect opportunity to silence him permanently. You knew his habits, his insistence on personally managing the Great Lantern, his pride in the family tradition. The method had been as carefully planned as any of Patricia's lesson preparations. Her access to the school's science supplies had provided the concentrated nicotine solution she needed, refined through her knowledge of chemistry from teacher training. The thin leather gloves she used for delicate cleaning work had protected her hands, while she applied the poison to the lantern's brass thumbscrew during the morning preparations. "I knew he would handle that mechanism if anything seemed amiss," Patricia admitted, her voice hollow with the weight of premeditation. "The poison would absorb through his skin within minutes, and the heat from the flame would vaporize any residue. It seemed clean somehow, quick and relatively painless." Miss Marple's expression remained compassionate but firm as she guided Patricia through the crucial details. The reversed thumbscrew had been deliberate misdirection, designed to suggest someone left-handed like Reverend Hartwell. The staged break-in at Mrs. Ashford's cottage had been another layer of deception, creating additional confusion while allowing Patricia to destroy any correspondence that might have pointed specifically toward her motives. "Most cleverly," Miss Marple observed, "you use the genuine grievances of others to camouflage your own crime. Dr. Pembridge's laudanum dependency, Reverend Hartwell's anonymous letters, Mr. Pike's gambling debts, all provided perfect cover for your calculated murder." The psychological manipulation had been equally sophisticated. By encouraging suspicion toward the obvious suspects, Patricia had created a web of competing theories that obscured her own guilt. Her position as village school teacher had provided both access to various locations and materials, and the trust that made her movements largely unquestioned. "I never intended for innocent people to suffer," Patricia sobbed, her composure completely shattered now. I thought the investigation would focus on the obvious suspects, that justice would be served without destroying more lives. But watching David torment himself with grief, seeing how the entire village has been poisoned by suspicion. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her confession. Through the classroom window, Inspector Craddock could be seen striding across the school grounds with the determined pace of someone summoned for urgent business. Miss Marple had sent word earlier, knowing that this confrontation would require official witness and formal procedures. "Inspector," Miss Marple said as he entered, her voice carrying both satisfaction and sadness, "I believe Miss Wells has something important to tell us about the events at the Harvest Lantern Festival." Patricia Wells looked up at the two figures before her, the gentle elderly lady whose quiet observations had unraveled her carefully constructed deception, and the police inspector who would now transform her confession into legal reality. The weight of her secret, carried alone for days while watching her community tear itself apart with suspicion, had become unbearable. In the classroom where she had taught children about honesty, responsibility, and the consequences of choices, Patricia Wells finally faced the full magnitude of what her desperate love and fear had driven her to do. The innocent laughter of students playing in the distance seemed to mock the tragedy that had unfolded within these walls, where a trusted teacher had planned the perfect murder and discovered that there was no such thing as a crime without consequences for everyone it touched. Patricia's formal confession unfolded with the methodical precision that had characterized her teaching career, each detail carefully articulated as Inspector Craddock took his seat opposite her in the familiar classroom setting. The afternoon light streaming through the windows illuminated the tragic scene as she transformed her emotional breakdown into something resembling a scholarly presentation, her professional training providing a framework for the most difficult explanation of her life. "I obtained the concentrated nicotine solution from our science supplies," she began, her voice steadying as she fell into the familiar rhythm of instruction. "It's used for pest control demonstrations, perfectly legal to possess in an educational setting. The concentration required for lethal effect was achieved through simple distillation techniques any secondary school chemistry teacher would understand." Miss Marple observed how Patricia's academic vocabulary provided emotional distance from the reality of her actions, transforming murder into methodology. Inspector Craddock's careful notes captured each technical detail, while Patricia explained her meticulous planning. The application to the great lantern's brass thumbscrew had required precise timing during the festival preparations, when her presence in the church would attract no attention. The thin leather gloves she used for handling delicate specimens had protected her hands while ensuring the poison would absorb through Mr. Thornberry's skin upon contact. The reversed thumbscrew was deliberate misdirection, she admitted, unconsciously rubbing her bare ring finger. "I knew it would suggest someone left-handed, pointing suspicion toward Reverend Hartwell. The heat from the lantern's flame would eliminate most residual evidence, while the festival's chaos masked any unusual symptoms until medical intervention was impossible." The confession revealed the full scope of her deception, from the staged break-in at Mrs. Ashford's cottage to the careful removal of incriminating correspondence. Patricia's knowledge of village routines and her access to school supplies had provided both opportunity and materials for an elaborate cover-up designed to reinforce the blackmail victim narrative while protecting her own involvement. The classroom door opened quietly during her explanation, and David Thornberry stepped inside, his face bearing the hollow expression of someone who had followed whispered conversations and official vehicles to their inevitable conclusion. His eyes moved from Patricia's tear-streaked face to Inspector Craddock's grim countenance, then to Miss Marple, who watched his reaction with profound compassion. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shattered trust and impossible choices. David's shock slowly transformed into something more complex, betrayal mixed with understanding, love complicated by the recognition of what desperation had driven the woman he cared for to become. He took a hesitant step forward as if to offer comfort, but stopped as the full implications settled over him. "Patricia," he whispered, his voice breaking on her name. "How could you, after everything we planned together?" Miss Marple recognized this moment as crucial to the village's healing process. "David, my dear boy," she said gently, "your uncle created an impossible situation for everyone who came under his influence. Patricia believed she was protecting not just your future together, but the welfare of others he was tormenting. The method was wrong, terribly wrong, but the desperation that drove it was born from love and fear in equal measure." Patricia looked up at David with eyes that pleaded for understanding rather than forgiveness. "He was going to destroy everything," she said simply. "Your inheritance, my position, our plans to marry and start a family. But more than that, he took pleasure in other people's suffering. I convinced myself that removing him would free everyone from his blackmail and manipulation." Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with finality. "Patricia Wells," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of official duty, "I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Reginald Thornberry. You are not obliged to say anything unless you wish to do so, but whatever you say will be taken down in writing and may be given in evidence." Patricia rose from her chair with quiet dignity, offering no resistance as Constable Sims stepped forward. Her eyes met David's one final time, a silent communication passing between them that encompassed love, regret, and acceptance of consequences that could never be undone. As the small procession moved toward the door, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy that had unfolded in this place of learning and growth. Patricia Wells, who had dedicated herself to nurturing young minds and fostering their development, had allowed fear and desperation to transform her into something she had never intended to become. The irony was not lost that in trying to protect her carefully planned future, she had destroyed it completely. The sound of footsteps faded down the school corridor, leaving David standing alone among the empty desks and children's artwork that had witnessed the final act of Little Wickham's tragedy. Outside, the village continued its daily routines, unaware that the mystery which had poisoned their community with suspicion was finally approaching its resolution. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with careful deliberation, understanding that while justice was being served, the real work of healing would take much longer. The great lantern had gone out at dusk, but the darkness it had brought to Little Wickham would require time and patience to dispel completely. The quiet that settled over Little Wickham following Patricia's arrest carried a weight different from the tense silence that had gripped the village during the investigation. This was the heavy stillness of a community grappling with the shattering of its most fundamental assumptions about trust, safety, and the people who lived among them. Miss Marple observed this transformation from her cottage window as she prepared her evening tea, noting how neighbors who had chatted easily across garden fences now exchanged cautious nods, each wondering what secrets might lurk behind familiar faces. David Thornberry's anguish was perhaps the most visible manifestation of the village's collective trauma. He had not returned to his family home since Patricia's confession, instead wandering the lanes with the hollow expression of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered. Miss Marple encountered him near the church that evening, standing before the memorial where his uncle's name would eventually be added to the roll of the departed. "Miss Marple," he said without turning, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had aged years in a matter of days. "I keep thinking there must have been signs I missed, warnings I should have heeded. How could I have been so blind to what she was capable of?" Miss Marple approached with her characteristic gentleness, understanding that David's question encompassed more than personal guilt. "My dear boy, love has a way of showing us the best in people while obscuring their capacity for darkness." Patricia's crime was born from desperation and misguided devotion, but it was carefully hidden beneath genuine affection and professional competence. Even the most observant among us might have been deceived. The revelation of Patricia's guilt had brought profound relief to those who had lived under suspicion's shadow. Dr. Pembridge had resumed his rounds with something approaching his former confidence, though Miss Marple noticed his hands still trembled slightly when he thought himself unobserved. The laudanum dependency that Mr. Thornberry had discovered remained a private struggle, but the removal of murder suspicion had allowed him to seek proper help rather than live in fear of exposure. Mrs. Ashford emerged from her cottage that evening carrying a sealed envelope, which she pressed into Miss Marple's hands with trembling fingers. "The original letter," she whispered, "the one Mr. Thornberry used to threaten me. I've hidden it all these days, too ashamed to show anyone, but Inspector Craddock should have it for his files." The document revealed the full extent of Thornberry's cruelty, transforming a decades-old financial necessity during her mother's illness into a weapon of ongoing manipulation. Reverend Hartwell had found unexpected peace in confession, his nervous energy replaced by the calm that comes from unburdening long-carried guilt. His anonymous letters, while misguided, had been motivated by genuine concern for his parishioners' welfare. The parish council had voted unanimously to retain his services, recognizing the difference between misguided activism and calculated murder. Mr. Pike at the Hare and Plough had reopened his establishment with subdued ceremony, the heavy silver ring that had briefly made him a suspect now safely stored away. His gambling debts remained, but the removal of blackmail pressure had allowed him to seek help from his sister and begin the slow work of financial recovery. As the days passed, Miss Marple observed how the village began processing its collective trauma through the small rituals that bind communities together. The weekly market resumed its normal bustle, though conversations carried undertones of reflection and wariness. The parish council met to discuss the future of the Harvest Lantern Festival, ultimately deciding that tradition should continue but with modifications that honored both celebration and remembrance. The great lantern itself had been carefully preserved as evidence, but the village commissioned a new one from the same craftsmen who had created the original generations ago. It would be lit next year with appropriate ceremony, though Miss Marple suspected the festival would forever carry the weight of this year's tragedy alongside its celebration of community and harvest. Inspector Craddock's final report concluded that Patricia Wells had acted alone, motivated by desperation rather than greed, and that her elaborate deceptions had successfully misdirected suspicion while she attempted to eliminate evidence. The legal proceedings would take months, but the case itself was closed with unusual certainty about both method and motive. Miss Marple reflected on how the investigation had revealed not just one person's capacity for evil, but an entire community's vulnerability to manipulation and fear. Mr. Thornberry's systematic blackmail had created the conditions that made murder seem like the only solution to desperate circumstances. While this didn't excuse Patricia's actions, it provided context that helped the village understand how such a tragedy could occur among people they thought they knew completely. The evening light was fading as Miss Marple completed her final observations of the case. Little Wickham would heal, as communities do, but it would be forever changed by the knowledge that evil could wear familiar faces and speak in trusted voices. The innocence of assuming the best in neighbors had been replaced by a more complex understanding of human nature's capacity for both love and destruction. As she settled by her fire with her knitting, Miss Marple considered how this case had demonstrated once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, most integrated into their communities. Patricia Wells had used her position of trust and her intimate knowledge of village life to commit what she believed would be the perfect crime, only to discover that perfect crimes existed solely in the imagination of those who committed them. The inquest held a week later in the village hall's paneled chamber brought the formal closure that Little Wickham desperately needed. The coroner, a precise man with the manner of someone accustomed to uncomfortable truths, delivered his verdict without flourish. Reginald Thornberry had died from dermal absorption of a concentrated neurotoxin, deliberately applied to the great lantern's mechanism by Patricia Wells, who had confessed to the crime. The death was ruled willful murder, though the circumstances suggested a plea of manslaughter would be accepted at trial. When the proceedings concluded and chairs scraped against worn floorboards, the collective exhale that rippled through the room carried not relief so much as the restoration of certainty in a matter that had made all certainties suspect. Miss Marple remained in her seat as the crowd dispersed, observing how faces already showed the subtle adjustments that would shape the version of events to be repeated over teacups and garden fences for years to come. Inspector Craddock approached her quietly, his expression carrying both gratitude and the weight of lessons learned. "We could not have managed it so cleanly without your observations, Miss Marple," he said with genuine appreciation. "That business with the chalk trap and the lavender scent. How do you notice such things when the rest of us are looking at the obvious clues?" Miss Marple smiled with characteristic modesty. "People are much the same wherever you go, Inspector. The motives, the fears, the small deceptions they practice, they follow patterns. Patricia understood this too, which made her deception so effective. She used genuine grievances to create plausible suspects, knowing that we would see what we expected to see rather than what was actually there." The weeks that followed brought the slow, careful work of community healing. Dr. Pembridge, freed from the threat of exposure, sought proper treatment for his laudanum dependency, his honesty ultimately strengthening rather than damaging his standing in the village. Mrs. Ashford emerged from years of fearful silence to become an unexpected advocate for others who had suffered under Thornberry's manipulation. Reverend Hartwell channeled his experience with moral complexity into deeper pastoral care, while Mr. Pike found the strength to address his gambling debts with his sister's help. David Thornberry faced perhaps the most difficult path forward. The revelation of his uncle's systematic blackmail network, documented in hidden files throughout Thornberry House, required months of legal work to unravel and make proper restitution where possible. His visits to Patricia in county jail became a source of healing for both of them, their conversations helping process the tragedy that had destroyed their planned future while acknowledging the genuine love that had motivated her desperate act. The parish council's decision to continue the Harvest Lantern Festival proved crucial to the village's recovery. Rather than abandoning the tradition, they chose to transform it, commissioning a new lantern of simpler design that would be lit not by one person but by representatives of the village's oldest families. The ceremony would honor both celebration and remembrance, acknowledging that traditions must evolve to remain meaningful. Miss Marple observed these developments with the patient attention she had always brought to human behavior. The case had revealed not just one person's capacity for desperate action, but an entire community's vulnerability to systematic manipulation. Thornberry's blackmail network had created the conditions that made murder seem like the only solution to impossible circumstances. While this didn't excuse Patricia's crime, it provided context that helped the village understand how such tragedy could emerge from seemingly ordinary relationships. As autumn deepened and Miss Marple prepared for her return to St. Mary Mead, she reflected on the complex moral landscape the case had exposed. Patricia Wells had committed murder, yet her victim had been systematically destroying lives through psychological manipulation and financial coercion. The crime was unquestionably wrong, but it had inadvertently freed an entire community from a web of control they hadn't fully recognized. On her final evening in Little Wickham, Miss Marple walked once more to the village green where the great lantern had stood. The empty space remained a silent testament to the night the light had gone out, but children played nearby, their laughter a fragile yet persistent melody of renewal. The new lantern would be installed next week, ready for the modified festival that would mark both continuity and change. Inspector Craddock joined her for this farewell visit, still marveling at how her quiet observations had unraveled such an elaborate deception. "You were right about human nature being predictable," he said. "Patricia counted on our assumptions about obvious suspects, but she underestimated how small details reveal the truth." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Thornbury, for all his power, made the same mistake. He thought he could control human nature, bend it to his will through fear and shame. But human nature, when pushed too far, often finds its own way of striking back. Patricia became a tragic example of that. She saw herself as a protector and liberator, but in doing so, became precisely what she despised. As she gathered her knitting bag and prepared to leave Little Wickham, Miss Marple understood that the village would heal, though forever changed by the knowledge that evil could wear familiar faces and speak in trusted voices. The Harvest Lantern Festival would return, its light flickering against the darkness, carrying both celebration and the memory of hard-won wisdom about the complexities of human nature.